Hey, and welcome back to Soul Podcasting, the space where we don't just talk about podcasting as content, but we treat it like the soul of your brand. And I'm your host, Demetria Zinga, podcast coach, strategist, and founder of the Soul Podcasting Collective, where we help visionary entrepreneurs and founders launch, grow, and repurpose podcasts that sound like their purpose and not just their profession. Now, before we dive into today's episode, I want to give you a little personal update. You might have noticed that I've shifted to a once a week podcasting schedule. Over the summer, I was publishing about 3 times a week. And while it was fun, it was also a lot. Recently, I've stepped into a few new music teaching roles, and I've been really enjoying those. Music has always been a passion of mine. I've been teaching piano, and I'm also teaching out of school. And so it's another part of who I am creatively. And I love that podcasting gives me the flexibility to keep pursuing those other passions alongside running a podcasting business. That's one of the gifts of podcasting. It can ebb and flow with your life, which ties perfectly into today's question, which is, how do you stand out in a saturated podcast niche? Because the truth is, podcasting is full of choices and voices, but the flexibility, the creativity, and the individuality that comes with it means that you can still stand out even in the most crowded of spaces. So let's break it down. The first thing is to start with your perspective and not just your topic. So I'll tell you a quick story. When I first started podcasting back in 2005, way back when most people didn't even know what a podcast was, I thought I had to sound polished and professional and, well, kind of generic. I'd listened to other podcasters, especially the guys dominating tech at the time, and I thought, that's the mold that maybe I have to fit into. But here's what happened. My episodes sounded stiff and forgettable. And I realized quickly that if I was going to keep doing this for the long haul, I had to bring myself, my whole self, into podcasting. So that meant my voice, my story, my lens as a woman, as a creative, as someone who cared about both strategy and soul. And that's when things shifted for me. People weren't tuning in just for podcasting tips. They were tuning in because they connected with how I delivered those tips. So I want to ask you, what's the perspective that you're bringing that nobody else can? Think about your lived experiences. Maybe you're a mom navigating business and motherhood. Maybe you're a father navigating business and fatherhood. Maybe you're someone who failed at something 10 times before you actually figured it out. Maybe you bring a faith-based lens or a creative twist, or even a contrary opinion that goes against the mainstream. Your topic isn't your differentiator, but your perspective on that topic is. So we want to niche down and then add personality back in. So yes, clarity does matter. And if your podcast is about business, that is too vague. There are so many people with business podcasts today. If your podcast is about business strategies for creative freelancers, now we're getting somewhere. So the mistake I see some podcasters making is that they niche down and then they strip out all of that personality that makes them who they are. They're so focused on staying professional that they lose the spark that makes them memorable. When I first launched Impact Podcast Coach a couple of years ago, which eventually fused into what I have today, which is Soul Podcasting, I niched into helping women entrepreneurs and founders. But it wasn't just the niche that attracted people, and I honestly think it was my voice, the way I blended strategy with storytelling, the way I reminded women that their podcast should reflect their purpose and not just their profession. And that's what made me stand out, or at least so I think. That's what people say to me. They say, Demetria, I feel like you are speaking directly to me through this podcast or through one of my other shows. So niche down, yes, but then you got to put your quirks, your humor, your stories, all of your vulnerability back in, because personality plus clarity equals memorability. Then you don't want to compete on volume. You want to compete on how well you resonate. So I'm going to get real with you here. For years, I thought that the way to stand out was to just produce more episodes, more content, more everything. And I produced a lot. If I could outpublish the competition, surely people would notice my content, right? But all that did was burn me out. So I was creating a flood of content without the depth to back it up. And so what I've learned over the years is that people don't remember you because you published 100 episodes. They remember you because one episode resonated so deeply that they had to share it with someone else, or they had to share with you personally, write you an email, send you a DM that your episode made a difference to them. Or even if they don't respond to you, they actually took action on your podcast episode. I'll give you an example. I once did an episode where I pulled back the curtain on my own struggles with comparison, comparing my downloads, my growth, my timeline to other business entrepreneurs. And I can't tell you how many emails and messages I got from women saying, thank you for just being honest. I thought I was the only one who felt that way. And yes, I did take action, and I downloaded that workbook that you shared with us at the end of the episode. And as you've noticed, if you've been listening to my prior episodes of this podcast, I like to share a CTA or call to action at just about every episode at the very end, where I share something you can download for free or something that you can do to act on what I've shared with you on the show. So whether that is my Soul Podcasting Blueprint or my Launch Confidently Podcasting Checklist, I like to share those on my episodes. And of course, those links to download them are always in my show notes. And then there are times when I like to share my services as well. But the idea is that when I'm sharing information, I love that I'm actually helping someone, right? And helping them to make a difference in their lives. That one episode did more for connection than a whole 20 episodes, because it was that one episode that made the difference in someone's life. So you can stop asking yourself, how can I produce more? How can I outproduce someone? We need to do 4, 5, 6 podcast episodes a week. You can, if that fits your schedule. And if the content is burning in your heart and you just have to share more and more, then share it by all means and don't hold back, because that is your schedule, your routine, and your rhythm. But remember that as you're sharing, the idea is to share confidently and from a place of confidence and peace. That you're at ease with your workflow and that it feels good to you. And instead of producing more, you should ask yourself, how can I connect more deeply? So in all that you produce, how well are you connecting with your audience? The next thing to focus in on is elevating your listener experience. And this is another thing that almost nobody talks about, and it's the experience of your listener, the sound of your show, the pacing, the way your episodes flow. Now, I'm not saying you need a Hollywood level production. I have interviewed quite a few very professional podcasters on this podcast, and I love every single guest that I brought here. Some have excellent, over-the-top, awesome studios where they've poured in a lot of money to set those studios up. And that's great for them. And great for you if you're able to do that. I say the more technology that you're able to use and implement that works effectively into your workflow and makes your life easier and makes the sound and quality even better, it's better for you. And it's great for your podcast and it's great for your listeners. And we want that. But at the end of the day, you don't have to have that Hollywood level production. You'd be shocked at how many podcasts actually lose their listeners simply because the audio is distracting or the structure's messy or the pacing feels all over the place. And so we do want to pay attention to those things. We don't have to be super high level in the way we produce, but we do want to pay attention to our formatting and our audio. So when I started tightening up my intros, adding some clear transitions, wrapping episodes with actionable takeaways, people noticed and they stuck around a bit longer. And they shared my content too, which is a plus. So think of it this way. When you respect your listeners' time, they'll respect your content. Simple as that. And then just remember that we're creating an ecosystem and not just a podcast. I talk about that a bit in episode number 54, where I share about podcasting as a strategic brand asset and not just content. So you may want to check out that episode, and I will for sure leave a link for that in the show notes as well. But this is the piece that has kept me podcasting for a little over 2 decades. If podcasting was just me sitting in a room talking into a microphone, I probably would have quit years ago. But I turned my podcast into a doorway, an entryway that leads to a community. And for me, that is the Soul Podcasting Collective. And it's also my coaching, my resources, my newsletters, my social media presence. Your podcast shouldn't live in isolation. It should point people somewhere, whether that's a community, a resource, a newsletter, or even just some deeper engagement with you. And that's how you move from just another podcast to being a space where your listeners belong to. So in closing, yes, your niche might feel saturated, but saturation doesn't mean that there's no room. And in fact, it means people are hungry for what you have to say. The key is not being louder in all of this saturation, but it's more about being yourself, just being you, really bringing your story, your style, your quirks, your voice to the table. And that's what makes your podcast unforgettable. So if you've been worrying about whether you can stand out, let me remind you that your perspective, your personality, and your care for your listeners are your superpowers. That's the magic that no one else can replicate. And if you're still wondering, am I actually standing out or am I blending in? That's exactly where I come in. My podcast audit is a one-on-one process where I'll review your show, your content, your branding, and your strategy. And I'll tell you straight up what's working, where you're blending in, and how you can stand out more effectively in your niche. You'll walk away with clarity, confidence, and a personalized roadmap for growth without burning yourself out. You can grab yours today at soulpodcasting.com/podcast-audit because your voice matters to you and to those who love listening to you. Don't ever forget that your voice matters. And in a saturated niche, your story is the one thing that nobody else has. In our next episode, very likely, we'll have another awesome guest. And then the week after that, I'll be back with more one-on-one content to share with you. So I can't wait to talk with you next time. Happy podcasting.